Unsolved mysteries attract attention for many reasons, but most people look into mysteries with the hopes of one day having an answer to them. Whether that's to satisfy curiosity, get justice, or find something more physical than simply an answer. The Watergate scandal had a huge impact on politics in the United States and on our language. The suffix "gate," referring to a scandal, dates back to the 1970s incident. But for 30 years, one of the most intriguing parts of the story remained the identity of one of the informants. In May of 1972, political aides working for then-President Richard Nixon came up with a plan on how to beat the Democratic Party. This involved breaking into their headquarters at the Watergate office building, taking photos of campaign documents, and putting wiretaps on phones. The initial plan was a success, but they later discovered that some of the wiretaps needed repairs. On June 17th, the men broke into the office again to repair the electronics, only to be caught red-handed. Nixon himself claimed not to know about the plan, but he did order the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation into the scandal. Despite the attempts to cover up his team's involvement in the break-ins, the truth would eventually come out. A key part of that was the work done by Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who used anonymous sources to get and check information. Nixon resigned in August of 1974 to avoid impeachment, and the scandal became an important piece of American history. When Woodward and Bernstein were working on their stories, they promised complete anonymity to their sources. Even after the scandal was over and the players had all been dealt with, they kept that promise. The chief source had been given the pseudonym Deep Throat, and it was his identity that people were most interested in. Woodward and Bernstein said that they wouldn't reveal his identity until the source had passed away. That gave researchers two pieces of information: that it was a man and he was still alive. There were a variety of people put forward for the potential identity of Deep Throat. Some believed he worked for Nixon, while others suspected someone from the FBI. FBI Associate Director Mark Felt was among those suspected of being the informant. He'd been trying to lead the investigation into Watergate, only to have the FBI's efforts thwarted by the CIA. Even Nixon himself suspected Felt, but thought that Felt knew too much. If he went to the public about Felt leaking information to the press, it was possible that even more would come out. Felt denied being Deep Throat for 30 years, but in a 2005 Vanity Fair article, the 92-year-old confessed that he was the mysterious source. Woodward and Bernstein then confirmed that it was true. People speculated about his reasoning for leaking the information to the journalists. He'd been looked over for the position of head of the FBI, with Nixon instead appointing Louis Patrick Gray as acting director. Some believed that this slight led to Felt leaking. Others simply believed that Felt was trying to complete his investigation, and leaking the truth to the press was the only way to stop the CIA's sabotage. When Felt passed away in 2008, he remained a controversial figure. Some saw him as a true patriot, while others thought he was a traitor. Others were just happy to have had the mystery of Deep Throat's identity solved, no matter why he did what he did. In September of 2021, a man named Norm M. was sentenced to 8 years in prison for stealing a Van Gogh painting a year earlier. But while the person responsible for the theft was now behind bars, it would be another 2 years before the painting itself was found. The painting was Parsonage Garden at Noonan in Spring. It was painted in 1884, during the 2 months when Van Gogh was staying with his parents in Noonan. The painting was an early piece, but showed signs of the color work Van Gogh would be most known for. In 2020, the artwork was housed in Amsterdam's Singer-Laren Museum. The pandemic meant the museum was closed, but that wasn't much of a concern to the art thief. The thief was caught on CCTV in the early hours of March 30th, breaking through 2 layers of protective glass to get into the museum. He ran straight to the Spring Garden, took it from the wall, and rushed out. Outside, there was a motorbike waiting for him. He and his accomplice sped away. 5 months later, the same criminal committed another theft. Not long after, the police managed to catch up with the criminal, identified only as Norm M. The Van Gogh theft wasn't his first, and he had a long history of art thefts. When he was found guilty of 2 of the 2020 thefts, he had no idea where the Van Gogh painting was. The judge noted that he didn't seem concerned about that at all. Prosecutors believed the painting had been stolen at the request of a criminal named Peter Roy Kay, who hoped to use it to negotiate a lighter sentence. That hadn't worked, though. Even when the police found the person who had initially purchased the painting from Norm, they still couldn't locate the artwork. An art detective named Arthur Brand would eventually solve the mystery. It seemed like a mystery that wanted to be solved. According to Brand, the painting was worthless to the thieves. They couldn't put it up on display anywhere, and there was limited value to it for criminals. The person who owned the painting by September of 2023 just wanted to get rid of it, but he didn't want to get into trouble. That person had contacted Brand about his situation. Brand was working in cooperation with the police and managed to make a deal so that the owner could hand the painting over without getting arrested. On September 11, 2023, the unidentified person showed up at Brand's apartment and handed over an IKEA bag with the painting wrapped in bubble wrap inside. An authenticator from the museum confirmed this was the stolen Spring Garden painting. It's now being housed at the Van Gogh Museum for scientific examination and possible restoration, but will hopefully soon be back on display. In 1868, a group of farmers in Denmark uncovered the burial mound of a man who had passed away 900 years earlier. The man was buried in a clay-sealed wooden tomb, wore clothes decorated with silk, and was buried with an iron axe with a silver inlay. The farmers distributed the contents of the tomb among themselves before archaeologists arrived and recovered them. Unfortunately, it seemed like this 10th century Viking wasn't in much better hands with the archaeologists. Sometime in the 20th century, his remains disappeared while being housed in the National Museum of Denmark. They wouldn't be found until 2021. When the remains and the grave goods were brought to the museum, the grave goods were much more interesting to researchers. At the time, human remains weren't considered archaeological artifacts. The bones of the Viking were stored without much research or care. He was identified as a male, but not much else was known about him. The objects were much more interesting. Silk would have been very hard to come by in 970 when the man was buried. He was found lying on a pile of down feathers, which may have once been a mattress. While the objects were studied, their owner went missing. When exactly the bones disappeared isn't clear, but by 1984 they were gone. A search in 1986 and another in 2009 didn't turn up the remains. Researchers believed they'd likely been lost forever. It was by accident that they were found. In 2017, a researcher named Ulla Mannering was looking at artifacts from a different burial site. Mannering was going through the boxes labeled as being from the second burial when she came across a box of bones. There was some fabric attached to these bones that didn't match the fabric of other boxes. It was interesting but not part of Mannering's investigation, so she didn't look into it. Later, Mannering started a new project about clothing in the Viking Age and remembered the strange silk fabric in the second box. She returned to it and found the bones were where they'd been left. The fabric was in the form of a ring around a leg bone. It looked a lot like a cuff from a pair of pants. That made it clear that the bones had been misplaced. The person buried at this second location had been a woman, and only men wore pants in that period. When looking for where the bones may have belonged, Mannering came across a well-preserved sleeve cuff that had been recovered from the first burial. Researchers realized that these were the missing bones that had vanished in the 80s. Scientific testing confirmed that these remains had come from that first burial. Researchers believed that the person was a nobleman and may have been closely related to Harold Bluetooth. That would explain his extravagant dress. Researchers hope that further study might provide answers about life for the Vikings in the 900s and solve more mysteries about the past. The disappearance of Wilford Eugene Morton is the perfect example of how one person with a small piece of information can help solve a case. Wilford was a 27-year-old man living in Clay County, West Virginia, when he vanished without a trace in 1954. It would take more than 60 years for this mystery to be solved. At the time, he was working as a truck driver, taking cars to dealerships across North and South Carolina. It meant a lot of time on the road, and he would regularly go up to 2 weeks without seeing his wife and 4 children. But he always came back at the end of those 2 weeks to spend time with them. That was until February of 1954. Wilford boarded a bus leaving Endor to head to South Bend, Indiana, where he would start his trucking job, and it was the last time his family saw him. When he didn't return at the end of his shift, his wife Opal contacted the trucking company that he worked for to see what was happening. She made a shocking discovery. Wilford hadn't worked for the company for years, and they had no idea where he had been going during his weeks away from work. An investigation into Wilford's disappearance began, though it seems to have been led by the family. There were a few possible explanations that were suspected. For some reason, Wilford's own father became a suspect. They believed he'd taken his son's life for some unknown reason. Others thought he might have gotten into an accident somewhere. Neither of these explanations would account for the fact that he'd been going missing for weeks at a time. The other possibility was that he had decided to start a new life somewhere else. The one thing everyone in the family agreed on was that he would stay in West Virginia. When his great-granddaughter, Kaylee Bruce, decided to take on the investigation, she thought this assumption might not be correct. Her mother had kept files of documents related to the disappearance, which were the starting point for Kaylee's investigation. She learned that at one point, Wilford had asked Opal to send him a photograph of their daughter, Kaylee's grandmother. Opal had told her own mother that hell would freeze over before she did that. So it seemed like, at least for a time, Opal knew that Wilford was still alive. Kaylee also discovered that the birth date on Wilford's driver's license didn't match that on his birth certificate. These clues indicated that there was more to her relative's disappearance, but it didn't point to any answers. She contacted blogger Sean McCracken for his assistance in the investigation. McCracken ran a YouTube channel focused on mysteries in West Virginia. He made a video about Wilford's disappearance, and within minutes it got a comment which allowed the mystery to be solved. A user named Edward claimed that someone named Wilford Eugene Morton had passed away in a car crash in New York in 1956. Kaylee decided to follow up on the lead and found a newspaper report from the time confirming the accident. The report stated that this Wilford had a wife in South Bend and listed the funeral director who had handled the burial. The funeral home was able to provide Kaylee with the death certificate. The certificate misspelled Wilford's name and had a different date of birth than the one she knew, but it also had a social security number, and that number matched Kaylee's great-grandfather. He apparently had a wife living in South Bend, which explained why he'd went away for work. Why he had chosen to abandon his other wife and 4 children may forever remain a mystery, though. But finding out the truth about the disappearance gave closure to his surviving family. For 30 years, the parents of Shaunie Warren were left questioning who had taken the life of their daughter. They would pass away themselves, never knowing the answer to that mystery. But in 2023, the man responsible was put behind bars for the rest of his life. Shaunie was just 26 years old when she lost her life. She lived in Buckinghamshire with 2 housemates. On April 17, 1987, Good Friday, Shaunie decided to do some gardening work. She borrowed an extension cable from a relative so she could mow the grass, and spent most of the day sorting out the mess. It was 6 o'clock by the time Shaunie finished. She loaded the bags of grass cuttings into her car to take them to her parents, who had a compost heap, but Shaunie wouldn't complete the 5-minute journey. Her car was later found in a lay-by on the A4 motorway near an area called Taplow, where it had a transmission or gearbox problem. The day after Shaunie disappeared, a dog walker found her body floating in a lake nearby. Her hands were tied behind her back and a scarf was tied over her mouth. She had marks on her neck, and the cause of her passing was drowning. The police suspected foul play, but a coroner claimed that Shaunie had taken her own life. This seemed ridiculous to many, as it would have been very difficult to have knots tied or to move her hands behind her back after they were already tied together. Another coroner left an open verdict. Despite the police believing someone else was responsible for this crime, they couldn't work out who. There were few clues at the scene of the crime, but DNA evidence was taken from Shaunie's body and the scarf over her mouth. Technology at the time limited what police could do, and the case went cold. It wasn't until a case review 30 years later that the case would be solved. The evidence was re-examined, and it was discovered that the DNA belonged to someone the police were familiar with. Donald Robertson was a 66-year-old man when he was charged in Shaunie's case in 2021. His criminal history involved many disturbing crimes committed against women in the area where Shaunie was found during the 1980s. He was already in prison when he was charged. Robertson didn't confess to the crime, but was found guilty at court and handed another life sentence. Sadly, Shaunie's family passed away before the case could be resolved, but the rest of the family were grateful they now finally had an answer to the mystery, and justice was served. In February of 1980, residents of an apartment complex in Anaheim, California, stumbled across a disturbing murder mystery that would remain unsolved for more than 4 decades. The victim in this disturbing true crime story was an elderly woman named Viola Hagencourt. Viola was 79 years old at the time of the crime and lived alone in a ground-floor apartment at the Pebble Cove Apartments complex. She was described as a kind and generous woman, and her neighbors cared about her. One of the younger neighbors called her grandma and dropped off cookies when she stopped by. They all worried about Viola's habit of leaving her door open at night, propped open by a can of soup. Sadly, this murder case happened in an area where Viola thought she was safe. She spent most of her life in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but had moved to California to get away from the rising crime rates and to be closer to her family. When neighbors hadn't heard from Viola for a few days, they went to check in on her. They discovered her body in the bedroom and called the police. There was no sign of forced entry, likely due to the can propping open the door, but there had clearly been a struggle. Viola had fought for her life, but her attacker had overpowered her. In her mouth was a piece of torn pillowcase, which was actually the cause of her final terrifying moments. An investigation into the murder mystery found DNA evidence on Viola's body and on the pillowcase. But in the 1980s, there wasn't the forensic technology to connect the DNA to the criminal responsible. There were no suspects on file, as Viola didn't have any enemies, and there were no other clues or witnesses who could point police in the right direction. The case quickly went cold, and it wouldn't be until 2020 that police were able to begin solving this mystery. The DNA samples taken from Viola's body were analyzed using various forensic techniques. In the years since, the person responsible hadn't had their DNA put in any database, but genetic genealogy gave police a lead. The science pointed to a man named Andre William Lapierre. Lapierre had been 22 years old at the time of the crime. He had a drinking habit which led to him being discharged from the army due to a related incident while driving behind the wheel. He had once been married, but by 1980, the couple were separated and she filed a restraining order against him. That led to him on occasion sleeping on his sister's sofa. His sister lived a few doors down from Viola. After he was arrested in 2021, he tried to claim Viola had seduced him, which had led to his DNA being on her body. The jury didn't believe this, and he was found guilty. The murder mystery was finally a solved case, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Joanne Harrison's murder mystery for years was an unsolved crime that made national headlines when it was connected to a serial killer. But a hoax meant the real criminal who took Joanne's life was able to lie under the radar for more than 20 years. It wasn't until the person truly responsible for this murder mystery had himself passed that the case was solved. Joanne was a 22-year-old mother of 2 in 1975. She had once been a machinist, but had since become addicted to multiple vices. Those that knew her still thought she was a kind person, and she had a number of significant relationships, but her problems often brought them to an end. At the time of the disturbing crime, she had been in a relationship with a man named David Cayley, who was trying to help her. It was November 20th, 1975, when she was last seen alive for the final time. She had a voluntary job cleaning at a homeless shelter and left work at the end of her shift at lunchtime. She spent the afternoon drinking, returned to the hospital to lie down, then returned to the home that she shared with David. If that had been the end of her day, Joanne would have lived. Unfortunately, at 10:20 p.m., she left to get a late-night drink. She was last seen in the town center 10 minutes later. Joanne was reported missing 2 days later when she hadn't returned home. The next morning, her body was found in a disused garage by a passerby. The investigation into the murder mystery began. The way Joanne's clothes had been put about her body seemed very strange, and there was a bite mark on her chest. DNA was taken from her body, but at the time the only thing that could be determined was that it belonged to a male with type B blood. Hundreds of people were interviewed and tested, including Joanne's current and former lovers. All were ruled out by forensic science. Police continued to work the unsolved case, but the files went cold. That was until March of 1978, when police officers investigating another murder mystery received a strange letter. The Yorkshire Ripper was the name given to a serial killer who claimed a number of women in the north of England. In 1978, both police investigating the crime and newspapers covering it received letters from a man calling himself Jack and taking responsibility for the crimes. He even sent a scary voice recording when the letters from the self-proclaimed serial killer didn't get enough attention. The first of the letters taunted police, saying, "Up to number 8 now. You say 7, but remember Preston 75. Investigators believed that this referred to Joanne. Her passing did have similarities to others that were linked to the Ripper, and it was found the saliva on the envelope belonged to someone with type B blood, bringing the mystery one step closer to being solved. However, when Peter Sutcliffe, the actual Yorkshire Ripper, was found, he denied any connection to the Preston murder. It was also found that the letters and voice recording were sent by a hoaxer named John Humble. Without any connection to the more infamous solved cases, Joanne's case went cold once more. It wasn't until 2011 that investigators announced they had finally identified the person responsible. A man named Christopher Smith was booked into custody in 2008 for an unrelated traffic stop. He was 60 years old at the time and had a terminal illness, but DNA was still taken. He passed away a few weeks later, leaving behind a note in which he said he had lived with the guilt for over 20 years and was sorry for the grief that he had caused. The letter was taken as a confession of some crime, and his DNA was tested against that found at Joanne's crime scene, and it was a match. Police said that they had enough evidence to charge Smith with the crime, if he had still been alive, and the case is now solved. In 2019, police revealed that they had solved a horrifying murder mystery that had been unsolved for more than 40 years. It was 1973 when Linda and Clifford Bernhard's lives were both devastated. The couple were 24 years old and lived in Billings, Montana, in a house that they had just recently finished building. The real horror took place on November 6, 1973. That terrible night, they were supposed to go to Linda's mother's home for dinner, but instead, Linda phoned to say that they wouldn't be coming after all. They were going to stay in instead. The next day, Linda's mother decided to go over to visit, as the couple only lived around the corner. She found the house locked up and nobody answered the door. This seemed strange, so she forced her way in through the back door and uncovered the murder mystery. Linda and Clifford were no longer alive in separate bedrooms with restraint marks. The back of their heads were a terrifying sight. Linda looked worse than Clifford, but they were already well past helping when they were later found. After they were taken into separate rooms and done in, the criminal responsible had untied them and collected trophies, which included all of Linda's underwear and some of her shoes. The house was incredibly cold, with the thermostat turned down and all the doors open. Police believed the criminal was someone the couple knew. Linda had said nothing about any guests when she called her mother, but investigators found the dining table had been set for 3, not 2. There was also no sign of forced entry other than that caused by Linda's mother. It was speculated that a contractor who had worked on the house may have been responsible for the murder mystery, but no evidence could be found to confirm any theories. When the local police formed a cold case team in 2012, The Bernhard case was high on their list of cold case files. DNA had been recovered from Linda's clothes that she was wearing at the time of the crime, but the sample didn't match any in the database. As with many cold cases that have been recently solved though, genetic genealogy was able to solve this mystery. Using familial DNA, forensic investigators determined it was one of two brothers who committed the crime. One, who was still alive in 2019, was confirmed not to be a match. Finally, in March of that year, police announced his brother, Cecil Stan Caldwell, was responsible for the unsolved murder mystery. Cecil had been a co-worker of Linda's and knew the couple. It's not known why he committed such a terrible act. Investigators speculated Linda may have been the main target, but Cecil had already passed away by the time the crime was solved. So the investigation behind this scary mystery will likely never be known. When the missing body of Arliss Perrys was found, officers believed she was the victim of a murder mystery that had to have a disturbing backstory. It wouldn't be until 2018 that this mystery would be solved. Arliss was 19 years old in 1974. She was newly married to a student at Stanford University and had moved from her home in Bismarck, North Dakota to live with him. At about 11:30 p.m. on October 12th, Arliss and her husband Bruce got into an argument about checking tire pressures. Arliss left, telling Bruce she was going to pray at the Stanford Memorial Church. Arliss was deeply religious, so this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Bruce waited at home. The church would have been locked up at midnight, but at 3:30 a.m., Arliss still remained missing. Believing something strange had happened, Bruce called police to try to solve the mystery. Police found the church locked. Security guard Steve Crawford said he hadn't seen anybody there when he locked up, nor when he checked in again about 2 hours later. But when Crawford unlocked the church at 5:40 a.m., she made the gruesome discovery. Arliss was the victim of a murder mystery involving an ice pick. Her body was arranged on display in a dark and disturbing way. There was DNA found at the scene of the act and a partial palm print on one of the candles that had been placed on Arliss's body. The palm print didn't match Bruce, and investigators eventually ruled him out as a suspect. For years, there were rumors that Arliss may have been the victim of some nefarious cult. The son of Sam serial killer David Berkowitz was active in New York 2 years after this murder mystery began. After he was finally caught, Berkowitz told scary stories about cults and claimed Arliss had tried to convert a cult while she still lived in North Dakota. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to, and so the cult followed her to California to take her life. He even claimed the person responsible had confessed in a meeting that he was present in. But Berkowitz wouldn't give a name, and in the end, police dismissed his testimony as a scary story with no leads. The case went cold until 2018, when DNA technology finally revealed it was Crawford's DNA found at the crime scene. Crawford had previously been arrested and convicted of stealing books and small-time art heists from the university, and allegedly had a grudge against them after he was demoted to the position of an unarmed security guard. It seems this was the reason why Arliss lost her life, rather than some scary cult. Police went with a warrant to Crawford's home to finally solve the murder case, but Crawford passed before he could stand trial. It wasn't until 2019 that the mysterious disappearance of Brenda Venol was found to be a victim in a murder mystery, solved decades later. By then, she had been a missing person for almost 40 years, but most who knew her did not believe this was a voluntary disappearance. Brenda was a 48-year-old farmer's wife when she disappeared in May of 1982. She was married to John Venables, a pig farmer, and the two of them worked the land that surrounded their home. They had been married for more than 20 years, and while things seemed idyllic to the outside, there was something much darker going on behind closed doors. When John told police that his wife had vanished on May 3rd, the community and the small village where they lived were surprised. According to John, that day had been completely normal. They had worked in the garden sowing potatoes. Brenda had spent time playing with their new puppy, and they had gone to bed as normal. When he woke up, Brenda had gone missing. A huge search effort began, which included police helicopters and professional and volunteer teams that went through the countryside, but no trace of Brenda was ever found. Many noticed John didn't seem too concerned about his wife's mysterious disappearance. John explained that Brenda had been suffering from depression after a bout of the flu, something she was seeing a psychiatrist for. It seemed he believed she no longer wished to be alive. When no trace of Brenda was ever found, it was then speculated that some other criminal must have found her and taken her life. The murder mystery would become a cold case, but not one that was forgotten about by Brenda's family or the community. In 2019, John sold the home and the land surrounding it to his nephew. His nephew brought in contractors to clear out the septic tank on the property. They were horrified to find human remains inside the tank, but DNA analysis confirmed this was Brenda. John had always been suspicious, but now it seemed impossible anybody else could have taken Brenda's life. He tried to claim notorious serial killer Fred West was responsible, but neither police nor the jury bought the idea that someone had taken Brenda from the property and returned to put her in the septic tank that most people didn't even know about. The tank itself wasn't in an obvious place, and those who had taken part in the initial search admitted that they had thought it was just a concrete pad. It would have also been impossible for Brenda to have climbed in and moved the heavy lid back over the tank after her. John was found guilty of taking Brenda's life, and her family may finally have closure now that the mystery is solved. As our nearest neighbor, Mars has been the subject of fascination ever since the era of space exploration began. We perhaps know more about the red planet than any other planet in our solar system other than Earth. But there's a lot we don't know about Mars, and many mysteries we're only just beginning to solve. One of the biggest mysteries about Mars is what's going on beneath the surface. Even when studying the Earth's interior, scientists aren't able to observe it directly. The reason we know as much as we do about the Earth's core and the surrounding mantle is due to seismic activity. By studying the different waves released by earthquakes and how fast they travel, geophysicists have been able to measure the density and size of these different layers and work out what they're most likely to be made from. The Earth is a very tectonically active planet, relative to what we know about the other rocky planets in our solar system. There's a lot of data to analyze, giving scientists enough to get a good idea of the Earth's interior. Even so, there are still gaps in our knowledge about the Earth. So if figuring out what's going on inside our own planet isn't easy, figuring out what's going on inside Mars is even more difficult. The distance is one thing. Each rover and mission sent to Mars is equipped with different scientific instruments. And there's a very sensitive seismometer on NASA's InSight lander, which reached Mars in 2018. But the number of instruments available on Mars is nothing compared to those on Earth. Since InSight touched down, it's recorded over 13,000 so-called Marsquakes. This seems like a lot, especially considering the fact that Mars was not considered to be seismically active. But on Earth, there are roughly 20,000 earthquakes a year, and Marsquakes are typically much weaker than quakes felt on Earth. Even so, each one tells us a little more about Mars, and a megaquake in 2022 revealed even more, and it also started as a mystery. The Marsquake was recorded on May 4th, 2022. It measured 4.7 on the Richter scale, making it the largest quake ever recorded on Mars. It released 5 times more energy than the next largest quake, and sent waves that traveled around the entire circumference of the planet. It also lasted 6 hours, much longer than any other quake recorded on Mars. A 4.7 magnitude quake might not seem like a lot compared to those on Earth, but scientists knew that this was a powerful event for Mars. At first, only one explanation seemed plausible. It had to have been caused by some asteroid impact. Mars's southern hemisphere is littered with impact craters. Being the closest planet to the asteroid belt, that isn't too surprising. At least 8 of the 13,000 Marsquakes that InSight has recorded were due to asteroid impacts. Scientists set about trying to find the location of this newest impact. It would have caused a crater roughly 300 meters wide and sent dust up into the atmosphere. China, Europe, India, and the United Arab Emirates all have orbiters around Mars and should have been able to spot the culprit of this mysterious quake, but there was no sign of any recent impact event on the surface. Scientists started to look for another explanation and realized that the source of the quake hadn't come from outside Mars, but from inside the planet itself. On Earth, quakes typically occur when the tectonic plates that make up the Earth's crust move against one another. But on Mars, there are no such plates. Previously, it was thought that Mars was too small to produce this tectonic activity, as it would have cooled too quickly after being formed. But now, scientists realize that different parts of the planet cool at different speeds. This caused tension between different areas. The quake in 2022 was the result of tension that had built up for 1 billion years being released. Solving the mystery led to an important discovery about Mars, but also more unanswered questions about what's going on beneath the surface. If humans are to ever set up colonies on Mars, finding out where these stress points are and where to avoid will be especially important. It's not clear yet why certain areas cooled at different rates, and if there's any way to predict where Mars quakes are more common. Unfortunately, solving that mystery may take a while. Shortly after the 2022 Mars quake was detected, NASA revealed that InSight's batteries were running low. It was powered by solar panels, but dust storms on Mars prevented it from getting more energy. At the end of 2022, InSight was retired and put on low energy mode. The mission came to an end 2 years after it had initially been planned to end, and after the module provided real insight into the interior of the planet. InSight might not be able to solve the mystery of where these Mars quakes are more common, but it did solve other mysteries about the interior of the planet. It also helped to correct some theories about what's going on at the core of the planet. Like on Earth, by measuring how long it takes different waves to travel throughout the planet, scientists could determine what the interior of Mars may look like. At first, it was believed that the core of Mars was a large ball of low-density material. The composition would have been primarily molten iron, like the Earth's, but also lighter elements such as sulfur, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. But these estimates don't line up perfectly with the data that seismometers had produced. Instead, teams realized that Mars's core was much smaller than initially believed, but denser. It was still believed to be a molten ball of iron, but surrounded by a layer of molten silicate. This is a combination of silicon and oxygen, and actually the same material that makes up the majority of Earth's crust. Another important discovery concerned the mystery of Mars's dichotomy. While the southern hemisphere is covered in impact craters, the northern hemisphere is relatively smooth and covered in volcanic lowlands. The cause of this has never been completely determined. By looking beneath Mars's surface, scientists hoped to discover why the volcanic activity seemed to be focused in the north. One possibility was that the two hemispheres were made up of different materials. But when scientists looked just beneath the surface, they found that the crust on both sides of the planet was not likely composed of different materials. There was, however, magma discovered to be flowing just beneath the surface. None has broken through to the surface in over 50,000 years, but even this activity underground was a remarkable discovery. There's still a lot to discover about what's going on inside the red planet, but each new discovery helps to solve these mysteries. Understanding Mars will not only help if we ever set up a colony on the planet, but it also helps to figure out how other rocky planets are formed, including the Earth and far-off exoplanets that might harbor life outside our solar system. On February 16, 1972, a fire took hold at the Veterans of Foreign Wars building in New Paltz, New York. The blaze attracted the attention of all available fire engines and a good deal of police officers, as well as the local press. But by the next morning, most of the residents of New Paltz were going on with their everyday lives. The people running the nearby Historical Society Museum arrived at work to discover that another crime had taken place that night, and many precious artifacts were missing. In the weeks that followed, most of the artifacts would eventually be recovered, but 2 paintings from the 1800s would remain missing for 50 years before being recovered by amateur sleuths working with the FBI. The robbery had taken place at 1799 Ezekiel Elting House, home of the local historical society, historic Huguenot Street. Missing items included an old prayer book and antique weapons. Some artifacts date back 300 years to a time when the area was contested between the English and the Dutch. In terms of monetary value, the stolen artifacts were estimated to be worth $30,000, but had greater sentimental value. It was a few weeks later when most of the historical artifacts were recovered. They were discovered in a Manhattan thrift shop and quickly returned to the society to be put back on display. Unfortunately, recovering the artifacts didn't lead police any closer to discovering the identity of the thief. Even worse for the historic Huguenot Street, not all the items were recovered. As well as the antique weapons and everyday items, the thieves had also stolen 2 paintings by artist Amy Phillips. Phillips was a self-taught artist who worked throughout the New England area between 1810 and 1860, painting various residents. Today, his work has been sold at auction for as much as $3.9 million. They provide a unique insight into the life in the mid-1800s, especially as the people Phillips painted wouldn't normally be the subject of paintings. They were often from important families in the local area, but would be relatively unknown outside of that small community. 2 of these people were Dirk D. Wynkoop and his second wife, Anatja Eltinge. Wynkoop was the descendant of some of the first Dutch settlers to the area. He married into the Eltinge family when he married his first wife, Sarah, and inherited farmland from Sarah's father. That land became home to a wheat plantation and was run through the use of slave labor. The plantation helped feed the American Army during the Revolutionary War and earned Wynkoop a lot of money as well as fame in the small New Paltz community. When his first wife passed away, he married her cousin, Anatja Eltinge. Around 1920, the couple had their portraits painted by Phillips. Wynkoop was in his 80s at the time and Eltinge in her 70s. Postcards with black and white images of the 2 stolen portraits were circulated to local art dealers, hoping that this would lead to the paintings being recovered. There was a reason why the works hadn't been sold to the thrift shop like the other stolen items. It was possible that the thieves thought they could get a better price by going to art dealers. Alternatively, the portraits may have been the main target of the theft, and there may have already been a buyer lined up before they were stolen. The other artifacts that had been taken were just a bonus for the thieves. Speculation about who might have been behind the crime appeared in local newspapers. There was speculation that whoever was behind the crime had started the fire at the Veterans Building in order to distract law enforcement. Alternatively, it could have been that the thieves were just being opportunistic and took advantage of the situation. The culprits in both cases were never found, and the case quickly went cold. Most people forgot about the paintings, but they would still come up every now and again in discussions by members of the historic Huguenot Street. In 2020, 2 members of the group started working on a new book. Carol Johnson, a librarian in Elting Memorial Library, was working with the Historical Society curator Josephine Bloodgood on a book about Jacob Wynkoop. Jacob was an African American who had fought during the Civil War. His father had been a slave on Dirk Wynkoop's plantation. As they worked on the book, the topic of the missing paintings came up again, and the 2 women decided to investigate. At first, it didn't seem like the paintings had reappeared at all in almost 50 years since they had been stolen. But as the investigators dug deeper, they found something surprising. In an online catalog of Phillips's works, they found 2 paintings that closely resembled the black and white postcard that had been issued by the Society in 1972. A lot of Phillips' works have the same features. People painted at the time typically wore dark clothing and were painted sitting in a 3/4 position. Matching portraits of couples showed the couples facing towards one another. All of these matched the depictions of Wynkoop and Eltinge. Small details, such as the box Eltinge was holding in her portrait, made the investigators believe that they had found the missing paintings. In the listing, it was claimed that the subjects were unidentified. Even more startling was the fact that they'd apparently been sold at auction in 2005. The auction house involved in the sale was Sotheby's. Apparently, the staff at Sotheby's hadn't realized the work was stolen and allowed it to be sold for $13,000 to a private buyer. This amazed Carol and Josephine, the two historical society members. According to their records, the paintings had the names of the subjects inscribed on the back, and it would have been easy for a professional auction house to identify the artwork and realize the paintings were stolen. After making this discovery, they contacted the FBI's art crime team, which specializes in investigating missing and stolen artwork. The FBI were able to subpoena Sotheby's and learn the identity of the buyer. The buyer lived several states away and often picked up artwork at auction. They had no idea that the painting was stolen and agreed to return the two stolen pieces to their rightful owners. The paintings were returned 50 years and a day after they were stolen and put back on display at the Historical Society's gallery. The Society hopes that the recovered work will help inspire New Paltz residents to learn more about their local history, including the darker side that people like Wynkoop were a part of. Some of the strangest historical mysteries involve strange medieval manuscripts that seem to hold some kind of secret knowledge. The most well-known of these is the famous Voynich manuscript, which has gone undeciphered for hundreds of years. While people continue to try to crack the mystery of that strange artifact, there are other medieval manuscripts whose secrets we've begun to uncover. One of these is the quote, "very curious Almanac" that was donated to the Royal Society of London in 1668. The Almanac was a small item and not much more than a curiosity for the 17th century historians and archivists. It consisted of a long strip of parchment folded several times to form a small booklet. When folded up, it would have been small enough to carry on a belt and was easy to overlook among the Society's more hefty tomes. It was given the designation MS-45 and largely forgotten about. But when historians recently started to digitize the archive, they realized that this small booklet was a mysterious artifact. There are two types of almanacs that were popular during the medieval period. The most common of these was used by doctors and contained information about the body as well as astronomy and astrology. At the time, it was believed that the stars and planets could have influence on the success of medical procedures, and that different zodiacs were connected to various parts of the body. As well as being a handy guide for medical information, they could help doctors identify the positions of various astronomical bodies and determine things like the time of year. It would have also carried a lunar calendar. There were also almanacs for farmers, which were called unlearned or illiterate calendars. They would be used to help farmers determine what tasks should be carried out at various points in the year, as well as having a calendar for Christian holidays. There wouldn't be much text, but the zodiac signs and various laborers would be portrayed in small pictures. What made the Curious Almanac so interesting is that it seemed to fall somewhere between the two. The almanac came in 3 parts. The main part was pages dedicated to the zodiacs, symbolizing different months of the year. Each zodiac was followed by a labor, such as sowing seeds, picking grapes, and harvesting wheat. The second part was the religious calendar, which showed the feast days for various saints as well as Christmas. The third part was a long astronomical calendar which allowed the user to determine the day of the week and hours of daylight over 3 19-year cycles. There was no area for medical information, and it generally seemed to be an almanac for a farmer. But the astronomical calendar was out of place. It didn't have all the information someone studying the sky would need, but it was complicated. It would take someone with some skill to be able to use it, as it was meant to be used, and wouldn't have been useful for a typical farmer. Even more curious was an aspect of the religious calendar. Here, there was a strange code made up of circles, open brackets, and periods. At first, the code baffled scholars, but it wasn't long before the historians working on the digitization project were able to figure out this mysterious code. It wasn't some long-lost knowledge or some deep secret. Instead, the historians working on the project described it as relatively simple. Arabic numerals were used in other parts of the almanac. These weren't in common use when the manuscript would have been made, but were common enough that people would have recognized them. Much more common were Roman numerals, and it's believed that this is what the code was. The circle stood for 10, the open bracket for 5, and the period for 1. This was used instead of the X, V, and I Roman numerals. It wasn't supposed to be a secret, and historians have put forward 2 theories about why it was used. The first was that it was simply done by bored scribes as a way to pass the time. It was compared to modern-day Sudokus, and would have been nothing more than a challenge to keep them occupied while making the Almanac. The other possible reason was to impress more illiterate people, who might not have made the connection between the strange markings and Roman numerals. It was supposed to look mysterious and unique, but not actually be mysterious. This kind of code does seem to be relatively unique, and not many examples of it being used have survived to the present day. There's one other known almanac that has used the circles, brackets, and dots for Roman numerals. It was dated to 1389 and is believed to have belonged to an official of the Benedictine Abbey. Who might have owned the curious almanac is still an unsolved mystery. The person who owned it was probably literate, as they would have been able to use the complicated astronomical calendar. But the year still revolved around farming and harvest. Of course, in medieval times, there were more than just doctors and farmers, but not many almanacs belonging to other individuals have been recovered. Even figuring out when and where it was produced required some detective work. By looking at the various inks used, it was worked out that it had been produced before the 15th century. The list of saints' days also provided a clue for the date. At the time, important holidays would have been marked in red or blue ink, which was the most expensive used for lettering. Green ink was then used for the next most important, and black or brown for the rest. In this almanac, St. George's Day was indicated with black ink, showing that this saint's day wasn't that important compared to other religious holidays. Scholars determined that it was likely produced in the late 14th century. The grapevines shown in one of the zodiac images suggested the south of England, as the timing of the harvest would have been too late for vineyards on the continent. 2 holidays for Edward the Confessor were indicated in red, which historians believe indicates the booklet was produced somewhere near London. A holiday for St. Mildred was also used in the calendar. Mildred was an Anglo-Saxon princess who was celebrated in her home country of Kent, but would have been relatively unknown in other parts of the country. That limited the almanac to the Kent or Greater London region. How it came to the Royal Society is also somewhat of a mystery. It was donated by a man named Sir Robert Moray, but how he came to own it is unknown. Moray was known to visit old second-hand bookstores and likely discover the artifact in one of these. In that case, the history of the artifact has likely long been lost. There could still be more to learn about this strange artifact. Scientific techniques were used to date the ink that was used and to try to uncover some of the images that have been worn away over the centuries. It's possible that in the future, scientific techniques could offer a little more insight. The not-so-mysterious code might have been disappointing to those hoping to find some long-lost knowledge or secrets, but there's still hope that other undeciphered manuscripts could have contained something more esoteric. The H.L. Hunley was a submarine that made history as the first to sink a warship, but its short career ended in a mystery during the American Civil War. After testing and advancements in technology, scientists now believe that they've solved the mystery of what caused the Hunley to sink. As it was launched in 1863, it was not surprising that the Hunley didn't look or work much like modern submarines do today. The hull was just 4 foot 3 inches in diameter, and it resembled a metal tube with a pointed end. There was space for 9 crew members, including the captain, who would all sit around a crankshaft that powered the boat. Twice it sank during tests, taking the lives of all aboard each time. But twice the boat was raised and put into service during the Civil War on the side of the Confederates. It was equipped with a torpedo, but this also didn't resemble much like what we imagine today. In the 19th century, this consisted of a charge on the end of a pole. This submarine would go beneath an enemy ship and attach the charge to the ship. It would be extremely damaging, but nobody at the time realized just how damaging it would be. On February 17, 1864, the Hunley was on patrol at the entrance to Charleston, where the Union had a Navy blockade. Taking out one of the warships would have been essential to the military effort. Those aboard the warship Houstonic did spot Hunley as it approached. The top of the submarine was just sticking out of the water. There was little that the ship could do against the sub, as they weren't prepared to attack anything beneath them, and definitely not something so close. The people aboard the Houstonic used hand weapons, but that didn't stop the Hunley from approaching and attaching the charge to the hull of the Houstonic. The weapon caused significant damage to the Houstonic. Within 3 minutes, the ship had sunk. Most of the crew were able to escape, but 5 men didn't survive the encounter. The Hunley's first attempt at combat had been a success, and soldiers back at the base eagerly awaited its return. But the Hunley would never return, and it was never seen or heard from again. There were conflicting reports about how long the Hunley survived, with some sailors seeing blue lights in the water that they believed came from the Hunley. Later recovery would show that the lantern aboard the Hunley didn't have tinted glass and wouldn't have caused the blue glow. When the Hunley didn't return, it was concluded that the boat didn't survive her first combat mission. There were a few theories about what could have happened to the ship. No Union vessel reported destroying the Hunley, but it was theorized that one of the rescue ships might have accidentally made contact with a submerged vessel and destroyed it without even knowing. The truth couldn't be known until the Hunley was raised. For the next 2.5 centuries, the Hunley lay just east of the Charleston harbor. Sediments would build up around it, covering the submarine from view, but the legend of the Hunley continued to be shared on dry land. In 1995, the Hunley was located in what was called at the time the find of the century. Despite the centuries of deterioration, it was still relatively intact. Careful excavation work began, removing the sand and silt that had built up around and inside of the boat, and in the year 2000, it was raised again. Now, investigators hoped to be able to get to the bottom of the mystery of what caused the sinking. The fact that the ship was in one piece helped to rule out a lot of theories. It was clear that there had been no damage caused by another ship, and an accidental ramming was out of the question. It also wasn't possible that the ship had been destroyed in the same blast that had taken out the Houstonic. In fact, the only damage that had been done to the ship was from it lying on the bottom of the ocean. The remains of the sailors aboard the Hunley only added to the mystery. All 8 men who were aboard were still in their stations when the ship was discovered. Normally, in the case of submarine sinkings, the remains of those on board are found near escape hatches. Even though the sailors would know that opening the hatch would only make things worse, it's human nature for people to try to find a way to survive. It seemed unthinkable that the sailors would have sat patiently at their stations if they had known what was going to happen to them. There had also been no distress signal or any signs that hatches had been opened for an escape. It simply looked as if the men had stopped working the hand crank and passed away. There were a few possibilities that were put forward, but all had problems. One possibility is that they ran out of air, but analysis of the size of the boat proved that they would have known about a buildup of carbon dioxide in the vessel, and they would have had enough time to surface before passing out. Even if they would have been caught by Union soldiers if they had surfaced, it would have been a much better fate than the pain that would have been caused by the CO2. Rachel Lance, working on a PhD in biomedical engineering, worked on the case while studying for her doctorate. It was clear that this wasn't a typical case. As well as the fact that there was no damage to the ship, the remains of the sailors showed no breakages either. What happened to them had left no signs on their bones. A new theory was put forward. By looking at the pole which was used to attach the charge to the enemy ship, it was obvious that the charge was still attached to the Hunley when it was set off. The pole was long enough so that there wasn't any damage to the ship itself, but it would have still been close enough for the people aboard the Hunley to feel. By using a scale model of the ship and the same powder used in the charge, Dr. Lance proved that the force of the shock wave that was produced could have caused the effects seen in the Hunley. It's impossible to say for certain that this is what happened, but given the evidence that's been uncovered, it appears that this strange wartime mystery has finally been solved. Like a lot of historical mysteries, this does leave some unanswered questions, particularly about the blue lights that were seen by sailors during the sinking of the Houstonic. These lights led to theories that the Hunley had survived for up to an hour after the attack, but this was clearly not the case. The true cause of the lights remains a mystery. In 2012, the Chicago Tribune released a piece on unidentified persons living in Illinois. These people had no identification and no memory of who they were for most of their lives. One was a woman who used the name Seven and had no memory of her life before 1976. It would be another 10 years before the mystery of Seven's true identity was solved. It was a winter's night in 1976 when Seven was located outside St. Francis Catholic Worker House. They were curled up on the porch wearing a military-style jacket and an aviator's cap. The worker house was a place for the homeless, and the mysterious individual was brought inside out of the snow and given a place to stay. It was soon clear that the person, who called themselves Seven, was suffering from some mental health problems. They didn't appear to have any memory of their past and referred to themselves in the third person. That didn't stop them from living a good life at the worker house, where they took up work as a cook. Seven's food became well known in the local community as being simple but hearty. There would sometimes be lines out the door of people who had come from other shelters to eat meals cooked by Seven. When they weren't in the kitchen, they could be found sleeping in the men's quarters at the house or smoking out on the porch. While Seven was a popular enough person in the home, they kept to themselves. They didn't reveal anything about their past life, and that was accepted by most. People who become homeless often have elements of their past that they'd rather forget, and nobody pried Seven for more information. But in 2003, things changed for Seven. They passed out in the hallway of the worker house. Doctors discovered that the cause was of a diabetic shock, and they would need round-the-clock care. This wasn't something the staff at St. Francis could provide, and Seven moved into a care home. It was then that the investigation to find out Seven's true identity really began. It seemed that Seven didn't only not want to reveal their past to others, they had very little memory of anything that had happened before they were found on the doorsteps of St. Francis's. They would describe fleeting memories of visiting the Indiana Dunes and said that they were a lifelong Cub fan, but there was little else. They couldn't or wouldn't reveal why they went by the name Seven. There was no social security number, and investigators found that they couldn't even take usable fingerprints. One factor that helped make things even more confusing for investigators was Seven's gender identity. They were biologically female but referred to themselves as a man. It seems that doctors at this time likely assumed that this was simply due to her altered mental state, not due to some personal choice, but we really don't know. This is likely why most of her medical records still refer to Seven as a she or a her, and that's why Seven is referred to as a female in this video, because that's simply as far as the medical history takes us. There's just so much that's still unknown. In the 2012 article by the Chicago Tribune, it was noted that there were 5 adults in state care who had no identities. Seven was the only Jane Doe, and the others were identified as male. The article came with a few photos, including one taken in the 80s at St. Francis. It was hoped that someone might know who Seven was. By this point, at least 37 years had passed since someone who knew Seven before her amnesia hit had last seen her. On top of this, Seven was now suffering from dementia, making her life even harder for her. In 2015, she passed away from a heart problem, with diabetes and dementia as contributing factors, but the work to identify Seven continued. New fingerprints were taken, which were good enough to be compared to police databases. This is standard procedure, but when no matches were found, the case went cold. It would be a few years later before the cold case investigators began working to try to solve the mystery. Police records aren't the only fingerprint databases, and the cold case team began by comparing the fingerprints to other databases. They found a match in military records. According to the records, Seven's name was Reba Bailey. She'd been in the Women's Army Corps, received a medal for good conduct, and was honorably discharged in 1962 due to marriage. With the military record, investigators were able to piece together a little more information about Reba's life and contacted her surviving family. Reba had been the youngest of 6 children. She was born in 1940 in the town of Danville, south of Chicago. Her father was a carpenter who moved around a lot for work, and the Baileys showed up in a census in Illinois and Alabama. In 1950, the Bailey family appeared in the Chicago Tribune where there was a traffic accident on the motorway. Reba's father had backed up to pick up a suitcase that he'd seen on the side of the road and was hit from behind by another car. Reba, her brother, and father were wounded by the incident but survived, though her mother passed away. In 1962, Reba was married to John H. Bilberry, another member of the Army who later served in the Vietnam War. Investigators were never able to find any records of a divorce, but Bilberry later remarried. Official records could only tell investigators so much. There was little about Reba's life growing up, and nothing about what had happened to her between 1962 and 1976. One of the things the records were able to provide was information about Reba's living family. Unfortunately, by the time investigators had uncovered Seven's legal identity, her siblings had passed away. Her husband and his second wife had also passed away, so they couldn't ask him what had happened either. But investigators were able to find nieces and nephews that knew of Reba and knew of their parents' search for their long-lost sister. Even though this younger generation had never met Reba, they'd heard stories about their aunt. Some had even taken over their parents' search for the missing relative and were surprised when investigators contacted them to say that they'd found their aunt. But they too couldn't provide much information about what could have caused Reba to lose her memory and disappear. There were stories of her visiting relatives in Arizona in the 1960s and visiting an aunt in Chicago. She'd also begun dressing in men's clothing before she disappeared. But at some point in the 1970s, the family lost contact with Reba, and she would remain out of touch. There are a few theories about what could have caused Reba's memory loss. One suggestion is that the car accident that she was in as a child left her with more permanent problems than were first thought. Another possibility is that it had something to do with her military service. She'd served at Fort McClellan, where chemical weapon training had taken place. The government admitted that service personnel might have been exposed to dangerous chemicals while stationed at the base. Some have speculated that Reba's gender identity may have had something to do with her disappearance as well. Unfortunately, Reba's surviving family are still left with many unanswered questions, some of which they may never get answers to. But it was a relief to know that she'd been cared for and to find out where her final resting place was. The solving of this family mystery after 50 years can also give hope to others searching for lost loved ones. Answers can still be found, even decades later. Our journey into these chilling cases begins at the Hidden Lake Apartments on Villa Road back in 1990. It was here that Genevieve, or Jenny Zetricki, a 28-year-old Ohio native and systems programmer for Michelin, had been struck down. It was in this apartment that the recent divorcee's body had been discovered. According to the Greenville Police Department chief, Ken Miller, an unknown assailant had entered the home by prying open the sliding glass door and attacked Jenny while she slept. She succumbed to suffocation and was only discovered 2 days later in the bathtub with the water still running. According to the police, Jenny had been moved to the bathroom after the fact. None of her items were stolen, but the contents of the victim's purse had been dumped into the sink, which had also been overflowing with water. They also found what was described as a threatening message left on the mirror, but it was uncertain if the note had been legitimate or a move to cover the assailant's tracks. Aside from the threatening note and the body, authorities had nothing more to go on, and months turned into years. Jenny's case file was stashed among the rest of the cold cases. While the homicide investigators continued to follow up on any new leads, it wasn't until 28 years later that they found the man responsible for the fatal assault. Some of the investigators by this time had already retired when they were brought back to work the investigation. One such retiree was Bush Banton, who explained that they'd been looking for patterns, but over 150 leads yielded not a single result. Other homicides had been taking place around the same time as well, and despite DNA linking Jenny to another case, the detectives were unable to come up with a suspect behind it all. It was only in 2018 that the Greenville police, with the use of new DNA advancements, were able to find the man. It was Robert Eugene Brashers, a man who first came into the eyes of law enforcement when he was convicted of wounding a woman in Port St. Lucie. He would serve 3.5 years in prison and be released in 1989. Little did they know at the time that this man would go on to commit many more crimes. After another attempted homicide, the victim came forward with a description of the man, and the sketch was displayed around the country, but no one came forward. With the help of Parabon nanolabs, genetic genealogy was used to trace family members until they managed to find a match. This match allowed them to produce the identity of the assailant in question. By this time, though, Brashers was already deceased, so his grave would be exhumed for more DNA sampling. Subsequently, this man was linked to the homicide of Jenny Zetricki, another assault that occurred in 1997, and a 1998 homicide cold case. As mentioned, the man had previously served time and was released in 1989, but he was arrested a second time as well, this time in 1992, and released again in 1997. Then, in 98, Brashers would be arrested a third time for breaking into a home and again was released. He'd been in police custody twice more after taking the life of Jenny, and still no one tied him to the case and was unable to link him to the others until almost 30 years later. While we may not have justice for the victims whose lives were taken by the hands of Robert Eugene Brashers, at least the cold case of Jenny Zetricki was solved. Alea Monet Freeman was raised in Newmark, New Jersey, where she attended West Orange High School. She then went on to obtain her undergraduate and master's degrees from Felician University. In 2020, Alea relocated to Wilmington, Delaware. She didn't know anyone there, but was looking for a change of scenery. Little did she know that this would be the place of her enigmatic disappearance. It happened just 3 years after moving there. Alea had spoken with her sister via text message on the 14th of September. The sister suggested that she should come and visit her with her daughter, Alea's niece. But she wasn't up for this and declined the visitation, claiming that the parking on her street was inconvenient due to a parade that was going on that day. This was the last time that Stacia would ever hear from her sibling. A few days later, on the 24th of September, Alea made contact with her mother via text message. This had also been the last time that her relatives would hear from her. On the 1st of October of that year, she'd been seen in the 100 block of West 10th Street. This was an area close to her apartment. It isn't sure who had last seen her or what she was doing at the time, but after that, all communication ceased. Alea was gone. The 30-year-old woman failed to attend her niece's birthday, something that the family described as incredibly out of character. A month and 19 days later, the apartment complex got hold of Stacia, who'd been listed as an emergency contact, and stated that Alea failed to pay her rent. The sister headed over to Delaware immediately after the contact was made, and the following morning she met with the authorities. They conducted a wellness check at the apartment and subsequently reported the woman missing. During an investigation, Alea's ID and debit card were found on the apartment floor. Other personal belongings had been left behind as well, and shortly after, the Wilmington police sent out a gold alert. The woman's family explained that it was not like her to just take off without saying anything, and she was always in touch with her family. Authorities were following up with any potential new leads and sightings of Alea, one of which stated that she'd been seen working at a store in New York. None of these claims were verified, though. Details of the missing woman and posters of her were soon released, but there was still no sign of her. Stacia later told one news outlet that they would never stop searching for Alea. Then, in an unlikely turn of events, Alea turned up the following year on the 26th of January. She was safe and unharmed, but no further details were given. It was never specified why the gold alert was put out, where the woman disappeared, or why she vanished so abruptly. While we still don't have any answers about the woman's disappearance, her missing person case was solved. Birna Bridjansdottir was the homicide case that shook Iceland and the world. Birna was described as sensible and outgoing. She worked at a department store and had no shortage of friends. These friends referred to her as their happy pill. On the 13th of January 2017, she headed to a club accompanied by friends. In the early hours of the following morning, the friends were ready to head out, but Birna indicated that she wanted to stay a bit longer. She left the club around 5 a.m., which was the time that they were closing up. The sun wouldn't rise until 11 a.m. in Iceland, so when Birna had left, it was still dark outside. It was also -9 degrees Celsius, or 15.8 degrees Fahrenheit, but this didn't deter her. Along the way, Birna stopped for food. Various surveillance cameras around the area captured Birna accidentally knocking into a stranger and dropping money. But Iceland was safe, and walking alone in the evening was not uncommon in the area. Crime was low, and the homicide rate was less than 1% a year. Cops didn't even carry firearms, and the odd narcotic offense was treated with a simple fine. It would take the woman at least 2 hours to get back to her home, so it was most likely that she would have caught a ride from someone passing by. The next thing that the surveillance cameras captured was precisely that: A red Kia Rio stopped alongside Berna and she got in. After this, the 20-year-old was gone. The following day, uncharacteristically, she never showed up for work, and when friends tried to make contact with her, they discovered that her phone had been turned off. Berna was gone. A search ensued, and it was discovered that her phone pinged a tower around 5:50 that morning in an area 6 miles away. A formal search had yet to be conducted right away because Iceland was a safe zone. Friends and family, though, quickly took to knocking on all the doors in the area in hopes of finding the missing woman. 2 brothers had headed the search at the harbor, where they located boots belonging to Berna. Surveillance footage of this area was reviewed as well. Here, they discovered that a red car pulled up there and a man was let out. He staggered onto a waiting ship and the vehicle left. He wasn't seen again until some hours later. Authorities discovered that the vehicle was a rental, and the person who rented it was Thomas Olsen, who worked on the aforementioned ship. Olsen, a fisherman from Greenland, was 25 years old at the time. He was tracked down, and so was the mysterious red car that he'd been driving. Berna's DNA had been discovered in it. Olsen fled, heading back to Greenland, but officers sent out the Viking squad, who chased down the assailant using a helicopter. It didn't take long for them to catch up to the man, and he was arrested. On the ship, $2 million worth of narcotics were discovered, but he hadn't been charged. Unfortunately, shortly after this, Berna's body was found on a rocky black beach an hour away from the capital. It was never clarified what provoked this slaying, or even how it had been carried out. Camilla Lairth Segura is a familiar name for some, since she was the co-writer of Katy Perry's Walking on Air, her 2013 hit song. Camilla was born in 1975 in Sweden. There, she worked as an actress as a child, and later moved to the United States, pursuing a life as a model and singer-songwriter. Aside from this, she would also direct music videos, live performances, and off-Broadway plays, which would take place in areas like New York, Paris, and London. In 2023, this well-known woman was 48 years old and living in a one-bedroom apartment located in Beverly Hills, California. She was living here with her 19-year-old cat, Morris. On the 29th of June that year, Camilla made contact with a friend who was in Sweden. There wasn't anything particularly out of the ordinary, and the text message was described as bland. The following day, a 2010 silver Ford Fusion with California license plate 6KZ-J725 was seen on a police camera leaving the Beverly Hills area at 2:40 that morning. The vehicle was Camilla's, but it was uncertain if she was the one driving, and after this, she mysteriously disappeared. It wasn't until a few days into August that another friend, Liz Montgomery, requested that a welfare check be carried out. This course of action came when the unanswered texts and phone calls began piling up, but police found no sign of the songwriter or her cat at the residence. The landlord of the property later told them that she'd been evicted. Plants were withering away on the balcony, and a for rent sign was placed outside. She mentioned to her family and friends that she'd been struggling to make her rent, partly due to pandemic reasons. Liz then filed a missing persons report with the Beverly Hills Police Department. It was never clarified as to when she was evicted or where she headed after that, but all who knew her found it uncharacteristic for her to leave without saying anything. A few months had gone by, and there was still no sign of the missing woman. In a strange twist, though, on the 6th of October that same year, it was announced that Camilla had been found. She was safe, according to another friend, Cecilia Foss. The discovery came after an anonymous tip came through the day prior. This source alleged that they'd seen Camilla in the city of Santa Monica, so the Beverly Hills Police Department watch commander requested that the Santa Monica police do a follow-up. The Santa Monica Police Department was able to make contact with the woman, who informed them that she was not in any distress and denied assistance from the police services. No details following this break in the case were released, and the missing person file was closed. It was never clarified why Camilla departed when she did, but the family did note that she does have a history of paranoia and may have left the area in a panic for unknown reasons. On the 10th of November in 1966, a respected figure, Dr. Helen Davidson's body was discovered. The day before, she had taken her beloved dog, a fox terrier called Fancy, out on a walk. She was reported missing, and 12 hours later, one of the 100 soldiers who joined in on the search discovered Helen with Fancy lying over her knees, whimpering, and a pair of binoculars around her neck. The find was made in a woodland area a few miles from the Buckinghamshire home in Hodgemore Wood. The 49-year-old had been struck with a piece of charred wood before she was brutally stepped on. At the time, Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Williams of Scotland Yard headed the Thames Valley police hunt for the assailant. The team pulled up all the known villains of the area, but all of them had alibis. The case of the birdwatcher's passing was ruled a random and motiveless homicide, and the search for who committed it began to wind down. Despite various appeals for information on the anniversaries of the homicide and a reward of £100,000, the case remained unsolved. The tragic event would stay a cold case for quite some time, until one author decided to dig into it. The true crime writer, Monica Weller, an amateur sleuth, began a 7-year journey of investigating the case, which had been unsolved for 50 years. She believed that police had ignored evidence that may have come about on the idea that it didn't fit in with their random slaying theory. Since the case was still active, Weller couldn't access any of the information and had no choice but to start from scratch. Luckily for this amateur sleuth, she had some lucky breaks in her progress. One such break was tracking down the forensic professor who carried out the post-mortem, as well as the forensic photographer who recorded the crime scene. The intense search eventually led the author to a key suspect. While speaking with people in Amersham who also knew the doctor as well as her case, a recurring name popped up: George Garbett. Garbett was a live-in gardener who worked for a London businessman and was living on the outskirts of Hodgemore Wood. This gardener allegedly suffered a brain injury during the Second World War, after which a metal plate was placed in his head. It was found that he'd also driven the bus out of Amersham Garage, was a loner, and was interested in both genders, something that was only legalized in England in 1967. The area in which the body of Dr. Helen Davidson was found was also a known meeting area for couples during the day, and for the more unwritten relationships at the time, this area would serve as a cover for those unwritten relationships. Weller believes that during the doctor's trip into the wooded area, she accidentally came across Garbett, engaged in activities that he would rather not have the world know about. Fearing that she'd expose him to the town, Garbett struck the unsuspecting doctor and made sure that she would remain silent. This research would be summarized in a book titled Injured Parties, and concluded the cold case homicide of the well-known doctor. The gardener did it. Unfortunately, though, no arrests would be made in the case because by this time, the man was already deceased. He'd passed away in a tragic ordeal 5 years after Helen had lost her life. It was the 27th of January, 1971, when Christina Nikita Coffey's father boarded an aircraft in Burlington, Vermont, which was destined for Providence, Rhode Island. The private jet took flight amidst darkness and snow. On board were 2 crew members and the 3 employees working for Cousins Properties, an Atlanta-based company that was working in Burlington that year. They were Nikita and Donald Myers, Robert R. Williams, Frank B. Wilder, and Kirby Windsor. It was just after takeoff when the aircraft mysteriously lost contact with air control. The takeoff was said to be expected, but shortly after this, all radar contact was lost. The jet produced no distress signal, no mayday, and no communication. A search ensued in an effort to locate the now missing aircraft, but to no avail. It was dark and bitterly cold, and the nearby Lake Champlain, which creates the Vermont-New York border, 3 miles out of Burlington, was frozen over. Once spring came around and the ice had thawed, more search attempts were made, and over another 53 years, 17 more efforts were carried out to locate the aircraft, but to no avail. In the 1980s, Gary Kozak heard about the mysterious crash and the inability to find the wreckage, and the case immediately intrigued him. In 2014, he spoke with family of those who were on board with another search effort that was being put together. Kozak thought that the plane was actually within one of the already searched areas, but had been overlooked on scans. When the 2014 search proved unsuccessful, the man became even more obsessed and looked over a sonar survey of this lake that the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and Middlebury College had taken in. In this scan, he discovered 4 anomalies lying on the floor of the lake. Kozak explained that sometimes jet debris may look like nothing more than a pile of rocks. He decided that they absolutely had to find this jet and partnered with a colleague, Hans Hug, of Sonar Search and Recovery in 2022. Together, the team discovered some anomalies in the data and soon found an old military aircraft in the lake, indicating that they were on the right track. Then a second anomaly was seen in the sonar data, and after just a bit more searching, the jet was found. It was submerged in 200 feet of water west of Juniper Island. The team managed to gather videos and pictures revealing a plane with red and black stripes. They also discovered 2 turbine engines and a broken wing. Aside from this, the site had been undisturbed. For 53 years, the families of the passengers on board waited for closure until they finally got it. The thoughts that their loved ones had crash-landed on a mountainside, a lake, a river, a meadow, or somewhere in the ocean had plagued the family for ages. After reviewing the images, Nikita immediately identified it as the plane that her father boarded all those years ago. But what happened aboard that evening remains a mystery. It was never determined why they lost contact with air control or how they ended up in the body of water, submerged and frozen over. The wait was done, and it was all thanks to the obsession of one individual, adamant about finding the missing aircraft. 32-year-old Patricia Beard was found deceased in her studio apartment located in the 500 block of East 11th Avenue in Denver in March of 1981. This came after friends and family hadn't heard from her or seen her for quite a few days and decided to do a wellness check. She was found on her bed asphyxiated. But due to the time of the incident, DNA technology hadn't quite advanced enough for authorities to determine who the assailant, or at least a suspect, was. The only thing that investigators knew was that the assailant had entered the apartment by climbing up an exterior pipe and through the window. The case would lay dormant for over 30 years. Patricia's homicide was stacked up with the rest of the cold cases and would be featured as one of the 18 most unsettling true crime cases that took decades to solve. Some forensic evidence following the homicide was submitted into the FBI database, where it would remain all this time. All those years later, one individual, a Pennsylvania man named Hector Bencomo Hinojos, was placed in a federal prison, where his DNA would be collected. It wasn't clarified as to why he ended up at the federal jail, but it was indicated that he had engaged in burglary sprees and assaulted his wife on some occasions. But this would allow investigators of a 30-year-old cold case to solve it finally. The DNA samples that had been sitting in the FBI database finally had a match. It was Bencomo. Detectives decided to interview the 53-year-old man's wife, who explained that he would assault her for not ironing the clothes, and was said to carry a sharpened blade with him. She added that on 6 different occasions, he would return to the house with boxes of china, silverware, and other household items, claiming to be keeping them for a friend. This newfound evidence and the DNA match placed this man at the scene of the 1981 crime. It was never discussed as to what the motive for this sudden attack had been, or if the victim and assailant knew each other at all. What is certain, though, is that Bencomo scaled the side of the building, entered the woman's home, and brutally attacked her. During interviews with investigators, the man denied ever meeting Patricia and stated that he didn't know her. He also claimed that he hadn't assaulted her, and even though solid evidence proved otherwise, he stuck to this. The man was subsequently arrested and pleaded guilty to the homicide cold case. He was sentenced to almost 50 years in prison for 1 count of second-degree homicide, as well as 1 count of first-degree kidnapping. Solving this enigmatic case marked the 100th case filed in the Cold Case Project. The name He Jiankui may ring a bell. He's a scientist from China who's responsible for a controversial field of practice: gene editing. Specifically, he's known for his creation of genetically modified twins, Lulu and Nana. This outlandish experiment sent shockwaves through the community, an experiment that the world dubbed as risky. It was discovered that he'd forged documentation from an ethics review panel so that he could recruit couples and expecting parents into his research. His gene editing procedure was known as CRISPR-Cas9. It was used to rewrite the DNA of the embryos, an alleged modification that would make Lulu and Nana immune to HIV. And then the scientist disappeared with no explanation. It was initially believed that due to the scrutiny he was being faced with, Jiankui fled to escape it all. but rumors began to circulate among Chinese tabloids, such as Apple Daily and Hong Kong's Ming Pao newspaper. These media outlets alleged that the man had disappeared because he'd been placed under house arrest by the Southern University of Science and Technology, the scientist's former employer. The Ming Pao newspaper reported that Zhang Kui was brought to Shenzhen by the university president and put under house arrest on the campus grounds. This came after the man's appearance at the Second International Summit on Human Genome Editing, which took place in Hong Kong. According to the report, he faced his colleagues and defended his experiments, which attracted nothing but global condemnation. A spokesperson for SUSTC, however, denied claims of Zhang Kui being under house arrest on campus and stated that none of the media sources were accurate and that they had no answers as to the man's whereabouts. Furthermore, the authorities of the area have yet to make a public comment on Zhang Kui's whereabouts, making the sudden disappearance seem even more suspicious. The claims and theories surrounding his disappearance were made even more complicated when considering other high-profile citizens enigmatically vanishing after attracting a bit too much attention through punitive action enforced by the local government, such as the case of missing actress Fan Bingbing. After these allegations had been made, the local media reported that they actually had no idea of the scientist's whereabouts. ABC also alleged that they'd tried to make contact with the man many times but weren't successful. Then, 3 years later, the man's whereabouts were suddenly revealed. He'd been in prison. Without anyone being notified, Zhang Kui had been arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison for what was referred to as illegal medical practices. Rather than lying low for the time being, Zhang Kui decided to get right back into the gene editing business. Strangely though, no one released the information that Zhang Kui had been in prison, and there wasn't a search conducted for the man when he vanished. His family, friends, authorities, and workplace never said a word. For 3 years, the scientist's disappearance remained an open mystery, and there was no conclusion in sight. Meanwhile, he was serving time for his controversial practices. Giovanna Amati was between the ages of 18 and 19 years old. It was the 12th of February in 1978 when the young woman was sitting in a car near her parents' villa in Rome. 3 gangsters, led by Jean-Daniel Nieto, forced her from the vehicle. Amati was born to an actress, Anna Maria Pancani, who never thought her daughter would become the victim of an abduction. She was taken away in a van and stationed near her parents' home. When a police investigation into the kidnapping ensued, she was moved and kept in a wooden cage. She wouldn't be found until the captors' demands had been met. There, she would undergo traumatizing events and be subjected to both emotional as well as physical abuse, while Nieto romanticized her. The captors had been seeking payments, demanding $1 million. When police failed to find the kidnappers and Amati, the courts ordered that the assets and accounts of her parents be frozen in an attempt to stop them from making any payments to the kidnappers. This was a policy that the Italian government implemented. This policy froze the assets of the victim's family. But concerned for their child, Amati's parents made use of ticket sales money that came from the release of the Star Wars movie at the father's cinema, and the jewelry that Anna Maria was able to sell. This money would secure their daughter's release after spending 75 days in a wooden cage. She was freed on the 27th of April in 1978 after a payment of $800 million was made, equivalent to around $933,000 at the time. Later, Amati would become part of a sting operation to capture the man behind it all. Nieto continued to send his former victim letters and flowers in the days leading up to his arrest. The operation was a success, and the criminal mastermind was finally captured and sentenced to 18 years in prison. In 1989, though, he escaped from the prison and stayed on the run for a good 21 years before finally being captured again in 2010. Newspapers would later report on the Stockholm Syndrome that Amati was alleged to have been experiencing following her abduction. Stockholm Syndrome occurs when the victim shares an emotional bond with their captor, possibly believing that they're in love with the perpetrator. After she was released from the wooden box the size of a coffin, the French gang leader tried to make up for it by countering the pain the woman endured with kindness. Eventually, Amati began to return his phone calls. It was alleged that he would comfort her when she cried, bring her pasta, and even played her music. Amati, though, denied allegations of being afflicted with Stockholm Syndrome. Despite the traumatic experience that the young woman endured, this never stopped her from achieving her dreams and pursuing her life of racing. The name Giovanna Amati might sound familiar to some, and that's because she's a well-known Italian racing driver. She started out at a motor racing school to further hone her abilities, and in the years that followed, she went on to win many times in the Formula Abarth series, which she began in 1981. In 1985 and 86, she advanced in this career, advancing to the Italian Formula 3 Championship, where she would gain another few victories. Then, in 1987, she advanced to the International Formula 3000. In 1991, Amati began racing for GJ Motorsports and managed to finish in the top 10. It was the 13th of June, 1993, when Jeanne Childs, a 35-year-old woman, was found deceased in her Minneapolis apartment. Authorities initially declined to state how she met her demise, but it was later revealed that she'd been struck multiple times with a sharpened blade. Neighbors across from Jeanne's unit began to complain about red water leaking from the residence, and police soon discovered the body in the shower of the bathroom. Vital fluid also flooded the bedroom of the home, and other DNA was collected during the initial investigation. That DNA, though, couldn't be connected to a suspect at the time, and the case went cold for the next 26 years. In 2015, new technology in the field of DNA testing led investigators to take another look at the homicide case and the samples they collected at the apartment that day. These samples were subsequently sent off to a private genealogy firm, as well as the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. 3 years after this, the sample was eventually submitted in an online website, and the two possible suspects were identified there. One of the suspects was a man named Jerry Westrom, who was 27 years old back in 1993. In 2019, officers started to survey the suspect, and to confirm that his DNA matched that of the crime scene, investigators would need a fresh sample of it. Luckily, they got their wish. At the time, Westrom was a businessman and a hockey dad, so the police in Minneapolis were able to track him down at a hockey game. It was here that the man would make a rookie mistake. He'd used a napkin to wipe his mouth before tossing it in the trash. That same napkin was quickly plucked from the bin by the police officers and sent for testing. It was a match. By this time, Westrom was 52 years old, married, and had also fathered 2 children. According to a spokesperson, John Elder, there was no known relationship between the assailant and the victim, which makes the case more difficult to solve. Elder also stated that due to new technological advancements, the authorities are now able to pin suspects to crimes they committed long ago. Westrom, of course, denied ever being inside Jeanne's apartment, but the DNA didn't lie. It was also discovered that he had a criminal history, which included various DUI convictions, traffic violations, a misdemeanor in Stearns County, and another misdemeanor in Isanti County for carrying an unlicensed firearm. Police subsequently arrested the man in Wade Park, while admitting that it had taken decades to nail a suspect in this particular case. They also revealed that the convicted felon's neighbors described him as an excellent family man who owned and operated his own business in Isanti County. It's uncertain as to what the motive behind the slaying was, but justice was served, and Westrom was found guilty of the first-degree premeditation and second-degree homicide. The trial began in August of 2022, which took a whole week, and after jurors deliberated for an hour, a guilty verdict was reached on both accounts. A 2024 article revealed that the man, who was due to turn 58 in May, would be serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The sentence would be carried out in the St. Cloud prison. For 26 years, the homicide case of Jeanne Childs had gone unsolved, and for 30 years it had not seen justice. It was all thanks to preserved DNA samples, new technology, a napkin, and dedicated investigators that the case could finally be laid to rest. Many of the scariest mysteries are the ones that the general public has no idea about until they're finally solved. That's because they involve espionage and counter-espionage, and it's uncommon for investigators to reveal they know they have a spy in their midst until after the spy is caught. So it was a surprise to most when a 58-year-old man was arrested in Berlin as investigators solved the mystery surrounding a Russian spy. Details about how authorities uncovered the mystery are unsurprisingly scarce. But in 2020, authorities learned that someone was leaking classified information from the British Embassy in Berlin to Russian agents. 2 letters had been sent from someone working at the embassy to Russia, and it seemed like much more had passed from this mysterious individual than words in his letter. It would later emerge that the individual had sent videos from inside the embassy, which revealed the precise layout of the building. He made sure to take shots from windows so that the people he was passing information to would be able to put the hallways and rooms into context. He also filmed the desks of the embassy staff, making sure to capture any photos of their families that they might have on display. Also sent were photographs of the staff members themselves and information about them, as well as documents that were labeled as classified. It didn't take investigators long to identify the culprit, tracing his second letter back to him. The man was David Ballantyne Smith. Smith was a security guard at the embassy. That meant he only had access to a limited amount of information, but it was enough to put staff members in danger. The investigators that solved the mystery put him under surveillance, trying to get to the bottom of just how much he had done and his motive. A sting operation was set up. Someone posing as a Russian defector was brought to the embassy. Smith was told to photocopy a document that the pretend defector had brought with him and to destroy the packaging for a SIM card that had been given to the man. The packaging, complete with the defector's phone number and a copy of that document, were found in Smith's apartment. He also recorded security camera footage of the defector and was recorded saying if he works for the embassy, they'll know him. If the defector had been legitimate, the leak could have cost the man his life. When he was arrested, Smith claimed he was just a disgruntled employee, but evidence found at his apartment suggested he was angry at both the UK and Germany and dreamed of earning a life-changing amount of money spying for Russia. In reality, he hadn't actually earned that much money, and he was stopped before he could send over the large cache of files that he had hidden. He was sentenced to 7 years and 2 months behind bars. More than 16 years after Cynthia Joanne Palacios' body was found at the side of the road, her family finally got answers in her disturbing unsolved case. Cynthia was just 21 years old when she passed away, and the mother of a 2-year-old daughter. She didn't live an easy life and had gotten into street work in Lubbock County, Texas. On July 15, 2003, her body was found on the side of a rural road. She had numerous wounds, and it looked like she'd been transported in a pickup with large wheels. Given the nature of her work, it was hard to track her last movements before she was attacked, and her case quickly went cold. Cynthia's roommate, Linda Carbajal, was in the same line of work. Around the time that Cynthia's life was taken, Linda did an interview for a local paper. She said she wanted to get out of the business, that it was dangerous, and she was surprised she was still alive. On April 19, 2004, Linda's body was found. She had been attacked in a similar way to Cynthia and left at the side of the road. DNA connected the 2 crimes, but there was little other progress. The DNA didn't match any on file, and the case went cold. It would remain that way until September of 2020. In Waco, Texas, a number of female real estate agents had gone to the police about a weird internet stalker. The man had harassed the women on social media. He found their phone numbers and left disturbing voicemails. The man was identified as Andy Castillo, and he had harassed countless women across multiple states. Victims were found in Texas, Arizona, California, Florida, Louisiana, Nevada, New York, South Carolina, Washington, and Washington, D.C. He was arrested, and his DNA and fingerprints were taken. Investigators working on Linda and Cynthia's cases then finally got the hit they were looking for. Castillo had been the one to attack these 2 women. He was charged with the 2 crimes and was awaiting trial when he passed away behind bars. Investigators believe he may have been responsible for many other crimes and are looking to see if any other disturbing mysteries may be solved due to his arrest. There are many stories of unexplained noises that have remained a mystery for years or even just a few months. Few are as terrifying as an eerie noise that plagued a small area in the town of Ipswich, England, for months in 2018. Authorities were first alerted to the noise by a mother living in the Bramford Road area of the city. For months, she had been woken up in the middle of the night by an eerie child's voice singing the nursery rhyme, "It's raining, it's pouring." The sound was like something from a horror film. Sometimes the rhyme would be sung only once before the night returned to silence. Other times, it would be repeated for hours. The woman was quickly able to determine this wasn't coming from her own home. She had 2 young children herself, but they weren't the ones singing, nor did they have a doll that was responsible for the noise. After months of putting up with the noise, the woman contacted local authorities to try to get to the bottom of it. It was hard to believe this scary mystery was actually occurring, but when the woman called authorities at 11:45 p.m. on September 10th, 2018, they responded to the alert. The nursery rhyme was clear to hear, confirming to the woman that she hadn't gone insane, and this wasn't all in her head. The noise was tracked down to a local industrial estate, where authorities found a speaker playing the creepy nursery rhyme. The eerie sound was actually an alarm played when a motion detector was triggered. The site's owner investigated the scene and found a spider had made its home in front of the motion detector. When it moved across the camera, the nursery rhyme began to play. They also realized the volumes were much louder than they had thought. The mystery was finally solved. Even though it was revealed to be something relatively innocent, it didn't make the memories of the late-night noises any less creepy. A disturbing, mysterious illness hit a small town in Kazakhstan in 2010. For the next 3 years, it spread through almost a third of the population. Doctors had no way to stop or treat the illness, and raced to try to find an answer to this strange mystery. It began in April of 2010. A middle-aged woman was at her stall in the market that lay on the road from Krasnogorsk to Kalachi. Both towns are ghost towns now. During the height of the Soviet Union, uranium mines attracted thousands of workers. Since they closed, the Krasnogorsk population dropped from 6,500 to just 130. Kalachi has a population of just 680 people. Out of nowhere, the aforementioned woman collapsed. The other women working in the market discovered that she had suddenly fallen asleep, and they called an ambulance. At first, it was diagnosed as a stroke, but then more people started falling asleep. The sleeping sickness would come from nowhere. People would be walking, working, or otherwise behaving normally when they would suddenly just fall asleep, often snoring loudly. Bouts would last up to 4 days. Sometimes people would wake up for brief periods of time. They could eat, smoke, or even hold conversations before going back to sleep. When they finally fully woke, they had no memory of these actions. Some told stories of strange hallucinations while they slept, including creatures that tried to eat their hands and snakes in their beds. The mysterious sickness hit every demographic from the very young to the elderly. How long a person had been in the area didn't seem to matter. One man who had come to town to visit his mother-in-law caught the sickness. Even pets were not immune. One victim of the illness was a cat. The cat started meowing and attacking the walls, furniture, and the family dog before it suddenly fell asleep and snored heavily. Scientists were at a loss to explain the illness. The local water and food were tested, but there were no signs of elevated levels of radiation or heavy metals. The air was tested for radon gases. While some homes had elevated levels, it wasn't nearly enough to explain the illness. It was believed that mines were to blame, but just how couldn't be explained. Finally, scientists realized it was something in the air, but it wasn't a radioactive gas. There were high levels of carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons in the air. The gas led to the sleeping sickness, memory loss, and peculiar behavior. Once the cause was located, the population of the 2 small towns started to be relocated, but some still stay behind in a place that's been given the nickname Sleepy Hollow. Just after Christmas of 2001, Kevin Butler's body was discovered in his home in Pleasantville, Texas. His pet cockatoo was found nearby, also having had its life taken. But just before it passed away, the bird, named Bird, had given the police the evidence they needed to solve this strange mystery. Kevin was discovered by his friend, Michael DiNardo. When Michael came to find out why Kevin had missed Christmas dinner, he found Kevin's home a mess, having been ransacked and his truck missing. At first, it looked like Kevin himself was just asleep. Then he discovered that the man had been tied up and attacked with both blunt and sharp objects. 2 of those objects were found nearby, with DNA that did not belong to Kevin smeared on the handles. Other DNA was found on a light switch. It didn't take the police long to identify a suspect. Kevin had been in a feud with a local man named Johnny Serna. Serna had previously worked for Kevin, but they'd recently gotten into an argument over money. Kevin had paid him with a check for $30, but Serna had changed it to $300. However, DNA found at the scene of the crime didn't match Serna's. It was a close familial match, though. Serna's half-brother, Daniel Torres, was arrested a few months after the attack on Kevin. Once in police custody, he confessed to the crime and turned on his brother. Torres and Serna's stories both changed multiple times, but the police were able to piece together the truth. On Christmas Eve, Serna told Torres he was still bitter about the argument that he'd had with Kevin, and the 2 brothers decided to go to his home to attack him and take what money they could. They tied him up and attacked first with their bare hands before using weapons from Kevin's own kitchen. Kevin didn't seem to have put up much of a fight, despite his large size, but his pet cockatoo was more defensive. The bird attacked Torres's hand and head, pecking and scratching at him before the criminal turned on it. The wounds were serious enough for Torres to leave red stains around the room, which would eventually lead the police to him. Both Torres and Serna tried to claim it was only the other that had used the sharp weapons, and it had been the other that had finished off Kevin. In the end, they were both found guilty of taking his life and were handed life sentences. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.